All right. Cool. So we're going to be talking about naming conventions, which is how do I name things correctly such that it makes sense for people who are reading my code, right? Uh, so when you think of naming conventions, there's like a lot of different kinds of conventions that we use across our project, right? We have file names, we have variable names, we have SQL table names, um, and then we also have this sort of convention of like how do I name my routes such that they make sense, right? So there's standards which have been created, which you should follow. That makes it easy for everybody to understand what your code is doing. So let's look at like the first one. So JavaScript file names, right? So the convention is to have, if there's a file name which is more than a single word, you would use a hyphen to split the file name. So like, for example, it would be like user hyphen authentication, right? So yeah, so that's pretty simple. Like, so for, in the case of a test, I would say, yeah, it would be like user authentication hyphen test.js. I've seen a lot of people do user authentication .test.js, and that's fine too. But so long as the test is indicated in the name. Cool. The next thing we come down to is JavaScript variable names. So we use camel case for the names, for the variable names, as well as like for the functions, right? Names for right? And the variable names should indicate the context about the data that they're holding. Right? So if my variable name is holding information about a user, it should have information about the user. It should be called user, right? So for example, let's say I'm getting the user from request.user, right? I could say var a equal to request.user. And in this, looking at this, it's very obvious that, okay, A is going to contain the user, right? But somewhere down the path, in some other place at the bottom, I say, a.name, right? If I just look at this in isolation, I have no idea what A is, right? I have to go back to the definition of where A was declared or where A was assigned to understand the context behind A. And that's a huge overhead on the brain to kind of keep like going up and down, like scrolling through code to like kind of reference back the name of the variable. Instead, this would have been much nicer, right? Like boom, right there I know that, oh, it's user.name.
When you have things like data, is it better to just call it data or user data?
Yeah, data just can be anything.
Or just user.
Right. It's like data just means like something, right? Information. I want to know what is the information under that.
I guess most of typically when you're the result of a database query.
So never call your variables data or result. These are the worst names ever. Because data doesn't indicate anything.
Does that include parameters?
What's that?
Does that include parameters as well?
Yeah. Parameters are names too. Right? So if you have a function which takes in data, I have absolutely no idea what this data is. Instead, if it was function posts, that's much more easier to understand. Right?
Yeah, makes sense.
So name your variables based on what data they're holding under the hood. Because data is very generic. It doesn't mean anything. Okay. The other thing is, so now you have variable names, right? But there's this other thing called functions, which are equally important. You want to name functions based on the operation that they're doing, right? So if I have a function called do stuff, it's a horrible name, right? Just like it's the same, it's the equivalent of calling your variable data, because it doesn't tell me anything about what the function is doing. It just like do, right? Like as a programmer, I want to know exactly what the function is doing, and the benefit is that I can just look at the name and understand what the function does. So if I have something like let's say max age of users. This is a much more, or maybe get, or maybe compute, I don't know, some sort of, if you're doing some sort of computation, right? This is a much more descriptive name of the operation being done under the hood. So I could just look at the function. So if somebody is calling this with users and let's say this was the call, right? Like I don't have to go into the implementation of this function to understand what this function returns. I know that the age is probably like an integer, right? So I know that this is an integer. I can trust. But if it was just something like, I don't know, compute age, for example, and this was data, this is way worse than what was the previous thing I had? Max. Compute max age of users. Right? So both of these are probably doing the same thing under the hood, but one gives so much more readability than the other. That is giving me more context. That is the maximum age. So even though you may sort of use a similar word, but indicate the exact operation that is happening under the hood. So that's basically function names. So to summarize, do not use generic words. Be very specific and very descriptive of what the variable name contains. And second, the function name, be very descriptive about what the operation is happening under the hood. And don't worry about the length of the function name. You have autocomplete in your editors, right? They're going to autocomplete it for you. So this is horrible. Don't ever use data or result as your variable name. The words name ever. Cool. So that was JavaScript variable names. So going to SQL. So SQL does not recognize hyphen as a legitimate character because it considers hyphen as minus. So you have to escape hyphen all the time. That means like if you have a column name with a hyphen in it, you'd have to use quotes when you are trying to use that column. If you're using underscores instead, it just uses it as like a separator. So you can just like you can do things like basically to select as opposed to right. So if you use underscore, you would have to like use quotation marks. So instead, always use underscore. If you use hyphens, you would have to use quotation marks. So always use underscores for your column names as well as your database names as well as your table names. So this would be like something like this, right? Something like this, right? So always use underscores in SQL. Questions so far for SQL? No? Good. Okay. So the next thing we come to is routing. I think this is like the most misunderstood I guess, usage of what people are considering RESTful routes. So, what is everyone's understanding of RESTful routing? Other than the fact that I've written it on Word now. But what does everyone think RESTful routing is? Or rather, okay, not even what it is. Like, why do we need RESTful routing?
Just endpoints that you can get that give you something consistent back that you know, like you can kind of like document like this route you're gonna get this sort of information back, and that way it's consistent and it's not like.
What do you mean by consistent?
I remember I was like, I just had heard this explained like the way like they were GraphQL and REST. And I guess compared to like spaghetti code where it's just like you just like write random routes, whatever that you can think of. It's like just having a method of like organizing how things are put together. Like if you're gonna query cities, you have like ID or just a consistent like documentation for the way you're accessing data, the way it's like organized in your app or whatever it is.
Okay, so it's a consistent way of organizing your routes. Okay, what else?
Because from what I heard, it wasn't like it's just like a thing that people do. It's not like there's like a standard. It's like you have to do this, right? It's just like the conviction for it, right?
Well, REST is a convention. It is a standard. So if you claim that your thing is RESTful, then you have to follow the RESTful spec that exists. So there is a specification for RESTful routing. So if you claim your application is RESTful, then you have to adhere to that spec. So what does RESTful spec say?
I'm assuming that if you're going to delete, it goes to the delete method.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get a page. It's just going to get that page. If you're going to post, it'll get it's pretty much doing what.
But what are you getting and what are you deleting?
I guess you're deleting the API, the information that usually request to delete. I'm not sure.
Cool. Okay. So something is happening with delete and creating, but what are we trying to? So what is the standard here?
Something from your database or memory store or something that you're.
So the technical term for it is a resource. We're trying to model and create an API for a resource, right? So you're exposing these operations on a resource, and the resources in your system are like users or posts or comments or logs or whatever you're trying to model. And you're looking at it from the perspective of the user interaction. So I'm interacting with my blog and I'm creating a new post. I'm updating a post, I'm deleting a post, or I'm viewing all the posts, or I'm just viewing more specific posts. These are the different operations that I want to do, right? It's kind of like interactions. What are the different interactions I can do? But the problem is like you want to create a standard so that it's easy to discover the routes firstly, so you don't have to think about what the different routes are going to be. So that's the idea. And second is also relationships, to model relationships. So sometimes you want to see all the comments for a blog post, right? So there is an implicit relationship between a comment and a blog, right? The fact that a comment is for a particular blog post. So how do I model the route such that I can manage these relationships as well? So if you take an example of what the RESTful routing for the users would look like, it's basically for the post. So /users is the prefix for all my routes, right? So the plural. So to make it generic, it is /resource pluralized is the prefix. Right? So we're going to pluralize the resource. So in the case that we are modeling a user, if that's the resource and the, or the domain. So domain and resource are usually interchangeable words. So we're trying to model this domain, right? We're trying to like interact with this domain from the outside, because our data is located somewhere inside of our behind our server somewhere, either in a database or it could be like in a file. We don't know. All we know is that we want to interact with it and we want to expose an API which can interact and modify the resource, right? And the data which holds this resource. So the convention is you would create like a route which is got a prefix of the domain that you're trying to model, the pluralized domain. And then if you're posting to it, that means you're going to be creating that resource, a new resource. Right? And actually, before that, right? So you have a user /new. It renders a new form, the new form page. You have when you do a GET request on the /users route, you get all the users, because at this point you're not specifying any ID. Right? When you don't specify any ID and you just post rather you just get the /users route, you just get all of them back. But when you do provide a specific ID, which is the unique identifier, which is a primary key for that user, let's say, then you get back the user with that one ID back. Right? Same thing with put, where I will have to provide the unique identifier if I want to update a specific user, because that's the way for my backend to know that I'm referring to this user. Right? So the ID here is the way for me to know which user you're talking about. Similarly with delete. So get, put, and delete. When I want to act on a specific user, I have to pass the ID. Everyone with this so far? Yeah.
So I heard that put and delete don't work in certain places, and it's better just to stick with post again. Can you clarify that?
Yeah.
Do
So
you know what I'm talking about?
yeah. So in a form,
Right.
if you're submitting a form using regular HTML, the form only supports get and post. So these are for like APIs. This isn't tied to a specific implementation, right? So the browser unfortunately limits, browser form limits the way you can interact with an API. So don't use a browser form, basically. You use Ajax or Fetch or something else.
So is it considered? So if I'm using a form to put, is that considered to edit? Is that considered RESTful? Since I'm not using the put route.
It's not RESTful. Yeah. RESTful is only if you're following this.
So if I'm pretty much updating a user, I had to use the put method, and therefore that would make it RESTful instead of post.
Right, and also not just put, but you have to follow the naming conventions as well.
That makes sense.
So how would you keep a simple blog? Keep the RESTful convention if you're going to need a form to update a post.
So if you're going to need a form, yeah. So when you submit the form, you submit it using Ajax.
Okay.
Use JavaScript to submit the form.
Instead of using like /method or the method and action thing, you have to have an on-click or something.
Yeah.
Is that how you would do it? Would you not use a form instead? Or help simplify it?
Yeah, I mean, so that's like, for example, I don't know if any of you have used Rails. So Rails like fakes the method.
Yeah.
Whenever you submit a form, it actually creates a hidden field called underscore method, and that underscore method is going to be set to like either put, delete, or whatever. But the form is always going to be a post, and then it like uses that underscore method to figure out whether it was a portal of RLLD. It's kind of like cheating. But I don't know if Node has a framework which supports that. I don't know. I mean, I don't think Express supports that. Right? Out of the box, it just looks at the method of the HTTP.
There's a module called method drive.
Got it. So you're saying
It's called method override. Yeah.
Express. It overrides HTTP verbs. Yeah, but it's still using Ajax because it's setting in header.
So it's just setting up the Ajax for you. So
Yeah, I wouldn't use this. Don't use this because you're anyway making an XHR request, and I don't even know what the intention of this is. But if you're using an XHR request, you might as well use the regular method and set the method to post. So maybe this.
query value. That's not going to work.
Oh, this thing. Okay, got it. Yeah, so this is probably what. This is also something that Rails does under the hood, where it passes an underscore method, which is a hidden field. So your action is all your method is always post, but your underscore method refers to what it is, and then under the hood it overrides the underscore method with the actual method.
Would you consider this RESTful?
Yes, your API is RESTful. Right? RESTful is a property of your API, not of the client. The client can do all kinds of hackery to make it work.
Even though the actual HTTP method is post.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say this is a hack. This is called like ninja programming. I wouldn't recommend doing this. I would make a JavaScript request with the method set to the right thing, because that's more predictable of like what you're expecting, and that's like a standard. Yeah. So getting back to this, like I would still make a Ajax request and set the method to the action methods and make those requests. Cool. So then the last example I wanted to share before we wrap up is if we have a nested, I guess I haven't written it, but if we have a nested thing where we wanted to create an API for comments, but comments are associated to a blog post, what would it look like? What would my prefix be?
/blog/ID.
It's actually not blog. Let's make it slash. So for the post. So comments belong to a post. What would the prefix be?
For making a new post, or for modifying a post, or for modifying a comment?
Comment.
Commenting a blog, so comment to a blog, yeah, blog ID function.
So would not be post ID comments at new or add create?
So this is just the prefix. I'm not even talking about. So the prefix would be like this, right? So what would the prefix be in this case?
Comments.
Slash comments.
I would think it would be post first, right?
Okay.
So you can grab the actual ID of it.
So you're saying a slash posts.
and then the ID,
Which ID?
the post ID,
Post ID
and then slash comments.
slash comments.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is the right thing. So you kind of want to get the post first, and then you want to find the comments associated with the post. Right. So like if you are on a blog, and you're looking at a specific post and you want to add a comment, you want to associate that comment to the post right in your backend. So you would have to send the post ID as part of your form params, and that would happen automatically if your URL contains the post ID. So then you can make that association.
When you're going to use a form to update and delete, should you include a hidden input field in the form?
For what?
To access the post ID.
No, you're sending it as part of the URL.
No, I'm saying for updating and deleting, and you're going to be using.
So this is the prefix for all the routes. So my get route would be, so get a comment. Right? That ID is the ID of the comment. Same thing.
I guess what I meant to ask was the easiest way of accessing the post ID.
Mm-hmm. From where?
From wherever you're going to update or delete it. I guess from the client's end.
So this will be the route that you're going to make the request to.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm asking what would be the easiest way of grabbing that post ID prior to making this call.
It's going to be already in the URL, right? If you have a form, your JavaScript would already know what the URL to post is. So this URL would have been constructed already.
Yeah, that's right.
So you already have the ID. You don't need it. Did everyone get that? So his question was like, how will I have access to the post ID? When you're generating the template, or when you're generating the HTML using a template, this would already be populated based on the data that you pass in at the time of generation of the HTML.
How about on a page where you're viewing a list of comments?
Yeah, it should be the same thing. In order to like show the comment, you would have to have the post at the time of rendering, right? You would have the post, you would have the comment, you would have the list of comments, and each comment would have the post ID associated. So when you generate the form, the action would already be this. So the action would already have the values for that. So these are all templates, right? The post ID can be the actual ID, and this ID is the actual ID. So when you generate the actual HTML, this will get replaced with the actual post ID and with the actual ID of the comment. Okay, I have a call at 11, so I got to stop here. Thanks, guys.